My area of research is poverty and inequality in the UK. And so broadly speaking, that's looking at how the income we have is distributed across different households. And I guess that's interesting in and of itself. We want to know what's happening to poverty and inequality just generally. And it's also, I think, important context when we come to consider government policy. So, for example, what the government's doing on the tax and benefit system is often motivated by a concern about changes in poverty and inequality. And so by having a grasp on the data and the reality of the problems that we have in this country, we can better assess whether government policy is likely to address those issues. Over the last 50 years, we saw during the 1960s and the 1970s, income equality was pretty well unchanged. But that all changed when we got to the 1980s, because in that decade we saw a very large increase in inequality right across the income distribution. And since then, we've seen inequality continue to rise, but pretty slowly. And that rise has really been driven by increases in incomes at the very top of the distribution compared to everyone else. So we can talk of what we talk of as a racing away of these top incomes from the rest of the distribution. So one explanation for the increase in income inequality we've seen is called skills-biased technological change. So in layman's terms, what the idea there is that the IT revolution, the use of computers across industry and other businesses and in every office, that's increased the productivity of high-skill workers more than it's increased the productivity of low-skill workers. And so as a result, wage inequality has increased, and that's been driving the increase we've seen in income inequality. Another explanation is the rise in the number of zero-earner households in the UK, and also the rise in the number of two-earner households in the UK. So as work has become more unevenly distributed across households, so income inequality has increased. When we think about poverty, we tend to use two broad different types of measures. The first are known as absolute measures of poverty. And the idea there is that we define a line in terms of real terms income, and anyone below that line is deemed to be in poverty. So I guess the most famous example would be the kind of dollar a day poverty line that we think of when we're thinking about absolute poverty on a global level. The second kinds are known as relative poverty lines, and rather than being fixed in real terms, these are related to the average income in a country. So, for example, the relative poverty line in Great Britain is normally defined as 60% of the median income. Well, the relationship between those two things is pretty complex, but I guess one place to start is to think that relative poverty measures the change in income towards the bottom of the distribution compared to the change in income at the middle of the distribution. So one can think of it, in that sense, as a measure of a particular kind of inequality between the middle and the bottom. More broadly, it's important to understand that what's happening to inequality across the population as a whole doesn't have any concrete implications for poverty amongst any particular group. So, for example, in the UK over the last 20 years, we've seen inequality continue to rise, albeit more slowly than the 1980s. But there were substantial falls in child poverty rates from about the mid-90s through to 2010. And that was largely as a result of the Labour government's conscious policy of trying to help families with children through the tax and benefit system. So we've got a consistent data set that records household incomes across Great Britain for the last 50 years. And so we can do things like comparing average incomes across years to see how incomes have been changing at the average and how growth rates compare across different decades or different periods. And within years, we can look at how incomes are changing for different groups. So, for example, in the last major commentary put out, we showed that while incomes amongst those in their 20s have fallen by over 10% since the start of the recession, incomes amongst those in retirement have actually risen, and so we can draw out interesting contrasts like that.